our work table, we have all of our dried greenware. Before it goes into the kiln, we're going to touch up the edges with a damp sponge. So we're going to take the sponge in our water, squeeze out almost all of the excess moisture, because you do not want to reintroduce moisture to your pottery right before you're about to place it in the kiln. You want it to be as dry as possible. So we're going to soften some of these edges that we carved in for decoration on the pie pan, as well as the flower frogs. We're going to soften these sharp edges from cutting the holes in them before we get them into the kiln. So basically you just take your as dry as possible but still moist sponge and you just run it over the sharp edges to soften them, because once they're fired you don't want them to not feel good on your hand. So, and when we do the final part of glazing these pieces, this will also soften the edges of the pottery, but this just provides an extra step that really finishes off the piece. Now the bottoms we burnished earlier, so those are already very smooth, so we don't have to touch those. So this is now ready for the kiln, but we're going to go ahead and I'm going to, with the flower frogs, just simply run that sponge over these cut holes, and see that takes the sharp edges off of the greenware. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this bat of frogs and things that will eventually be magnets, and then we'll start getting everything into the kiln. So now we come to the part of the process where we actually put the greenware into the kiln and fire it for its bisque fire. So things to keep in note when you are putting pottery into the kiln. With the bisque load, which is what we're doing now, pieces can touch. So these can touch. In fact, you could even fire them inside of each other, so you can fit a lot more into the load. And for this model of kiln, the reason I have these posts in is the thermocouple. I don't know if you can see it in the frame, but down here is what's called the thermocouple, and that's basically the thermometer for a automatic kiln. So it registers the temperature as it's fired and knows how quickly to increase the temperature, lower the temperature, and turn off the kiln once everything's finished. You want to leave a 1 to 2 inch space. I try and give it a good 2 inch space around the thermocouple. You don't want anything up against it or touching it, because that will throw off your readings. So right now we're putting in our pottery, and I'm actually gonna, I have a little glazed spot there. I'm gonna give that a wide berth. So now we're going to lay down just a half shelf here. Just make sure it's nice and stable. And then we can get in our pie pan And the last two little tumblers that we have. So now we get to the part of actually programming the kiln. Now this kiln that I have is a Scott KM1018, so it isn't considered an automatic kiln. The newer models have a touchscreen display. This one still has your typical buttons, but I actually like this because I can repair it when things go wrong. It also has pre-programmed cone fire modes, and that's what we're going to use today for the bisque fire. We're not really doing anything fancy. I don't really work in crystalline glazes, and I make sure my pottery is completely dry before I put it into the kiln for the bisque fire. If we were doing some sort of studio work with students and things like that, where we need to move work a bit more quickly, then we could do what's called candling, and then we would get into the actual programming of what's called a candling fire before you do your actual bisque fire. And basically that just heats it up so that the water, in any residual water still left in the pottery, would evaporate off before it gets to the bisque stage. That prevents the pottery from exploding, helps prevent the pottery from exploding as it turns into ceramic. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to, I like to hit stop, just make sure that it's completely clear. The first thing you do is cone fire, and for our bisque we're going to do cone 04, enter. I'm going to do a medium, hit enter again. I'm not doing any type of hold, enter again, and then before I turn it on I'm going to do a review. So we see cone 04, 1945 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we hit start. Whoop. And then we hit start. And it will say that it's on. And if you heard that click, I always wait until I hear the click, because that's when the elements are actually starting to get energy to them, and that means that it is beginning its firing. If for whatever reason you turn it on and you don't hear the click, something's wrong and it's time to troubleshoot. But since I do fire indoors, I do have a vent system hooked up to the kiln, but I will turn that on in a little bit because it is extremely loud. So there you have the bisque fire starting. The firing itself will take more likely about 8 hours to reach its full 1945 degrees Fahrenheit. And once that happens, the kiln will turn itself off because of that thermocouple, that thermometer inside of there, and then it will cool just naturally very slowly because it's insulated with 2.5-inch fire brick. So just like an oven, you turn it off, it takes a long time to cool down, but the cool down for this, instead of, like an oven, it's coming from a much higher temperature. So we actually will not be able to open this until tomorrow evening. And then next week we'll go ahead and glaze the pieces. We'll talk about glazing technique and how to load the kiln for a glaze fire, and that's when we'll have the finished pie pan.